Welcome to the Montana State University Extension Profitability in Montana Agriculture Podcast. I'm John Hawley, and I serve as Director of Communications for Montana State University Extension. This series spotlights MSU Extension subject matter experts and others whose applied research and outreach help farmers and ranchers make informed, profitable decisions across the state. Before we get started today, a little bit about who we are at MSU Extension before we jump into these first topics. Montana State University Extension is an organization of 97 extension agents, 45 subject matter experts serving local needs across Montana's 56 counties and 7 reservations. We improve lives and communities across the state by providing unbiased, research based education that integrates learning, discovery, and engagement to strengthen social, economic, and environmental well being. Well, now that I've made our pitch for extension and introduced the podcast, let's hear from our guest today. Sam Wyffels is with me. He is our extension beef specialist and an assistant professor here at MSU. Sam, tell us a bit about you, what you do for MSU Extension, and we're going to get deep into the programs and educational resources you offer today.
Perfect. Well, thank you, John. Thanks for having me. So I am an extension beef specialist here at Montana State University. And so a lot of the things I do is, take science research and try to make that translatable to a producer audience. Try to transfer some of that scientific knowledge to management and application. A lot of the things that I do a lot of work with here in Montana are grazing animal nutrition strategies, associated with that to make sure that our animals are at the productive spot we want them to be. And then just through some of my PhD work and some, I guess you can call me a little bit of a tech nerd, I have found myself in this precision technology space as well. And how does precision technology apply to livestock production systems? And actually have developed a class here at Montana State for undergraduates in that exact area.
Awesome. Well, yeah, and it's funny for those listening. Sam and I were joking before the recording. We're not going to get too deep into economics today, but as Sam could probably share, that topic of precision agriculture is really hot on the MSU campus right now. It's very popular across that sort of academic segment. So maybe let's start there. When you think of precision agriculture, we're going to get into that topic of profitability without going too in depth on the economics. Maybe introduce this concept of precision technology, precision agriculture as it applies to beef cattle production, management, and all the things that you do.
Yeah, well, I mean, when we think about precision technology in general, it's more looking at managing on the unit instead of the whole. And so when we think about that from a agricultural point, it's managing variation within like a crop field versus just managing the field as one unit. Um, when it comes to the animal side, it's basically being able to manage on an individual animal basis versus herd or across multiple herds. And so just being a little more precise with your overall management. Really, precision agriculture is not necessarily a new topic. It's something that I worked with in a previous life when I worked for NRCS back in Oregon. But when it comes to how that technology applies to livestock, that's what's relatively new and has been and going crazy lately. So a bunch of the new things that are coming out in the livestock world that are kind of making waves are things like GPS ear tags or virtual fence. There's some automated feeder systems and sensor ear tags. We've even used some electronic boluses that you actually put inside the cow and can monitor ruminal conditions over time when feeding or things like that. And yeah, we can talk a lot on that moving forward. But yeah, those are kind of all things that are new. Even use of drones in livestock production systems is climbing substantially.
Yeah, I've had the opportunity, and maybe some of our listeners too, to see you present before. I've seen some projects similar to your work that Jared Beaver, who is another specialist for MSU, has presented on, as well as folks like Brent Rader, who's our sheep and wool specialist. I think maybe there's some apprehension when I talk to producers and having been an agent in the past about the cost of integrating precision technologies and everything. As I'm looking at my notes here, everything in farming is about return on investment, right? We feed our cattle so much corn and hay and grass, and we have this much land. what's it going to be as far as what I make and what's my investment and such. So what's your general pitch when you talk to producers, or maybe that extension agent in a local county passes a call up to you and says, "Hey, this guy's looking at adopting this technology, but he or she is a bit apprehensive about cost or about the value." So what's, broadly around that, when you think of return on investment and adopting precision technologies, what's your conversations like with producers?
Yeah, and I think that really depends on a producer to producer variations, I guess you could say. Like what could help one producer dramatically in their operation may not be all that beneficial for another one. So there's no one size fits all. There's no silver bullet out there. But what I would say we found is that, um, for instance, we can use like GPS ear tags as an example here. But some producers breed out on rangeland and they may be out in a 10,000 acre allotment or something bigger, and it's time to bring those bulls home. Well, they can hire a cowboy crew that gets to then ride that whole 10,000 acres looking for every little hole that a bull could be hiding in. And so those GPS ear tags have the opportunity to let those riders know where those bulls are before they go out there and get them, and which can substantially reduce the amount of time it takes them to do that. So there can be some labor savings options there. Virtual fence, this is another one I hear a lot, is that there's certain guys that do a lot of intensive management. And in the past, they've done that with stringing out a temporary electric fence and then moving that electric fence every so often to rotate cows across the pasture or through a certain area. And it's not uncommon to hear guys that they hire somebody in the summer that's straight job is nothing but moving electric fence and keeping ahead of those cows. And so virtual fence offers an opportunity to potentially not need that electric fence and allow that person that you're going to hire to maybe do something else that would be productive for the ranch as well. So there's a lot of interesting things there on return on investments. I would say the big ones that I hear are associated with virtual fence. That's probably the hottest technology in livestock production systems right now. And already gave you the example of the temporary electric fence and some labor savings or at least time savings there. But some of the things that I think is interesting that I'm hearing producers who have adopted this technology talk about are things like, well, what's the value of that forage in the back corner that I could never get cows to ever go and graze that now I can? So, as we think about if we can free up or make forage more available that cows weren't grazing before, that can extend some of our grazing season, which then would reduce the reliance on having to feed hay, and things like that. I've also heard producers, I like to think about when you have these collars on or these ear tags in some sense, it's like almost having somebody watching your cows 24/7. Like, we can't be out there watching those cows 24/7. But I know of guys who've gotten notifications on their phones through a virtual fence app saying, "Hey, we noticed these 5 animals haven't moved for quite some time." They went and checked on them, and those animals were actually stuck in the mud in an old reservoir, and they were able to save those animals where they may not have been able to, um, get there in time or know that those animals were stuck. Another quick example I've heard is, even though this group didn't have their virtual fence turned on, the callers were still tracking the locations of the animals and where they were, and they were out on a forest pasture. It turns out somebody was out riding an ATV or something and left a gate open, and I think most of our producers listening can relate to this. Somebody left a gate open, and within minutes, they knew that, hey, this gate's open because we got cows leaving the pasture, and they were able to be up there within an hour or two to get those cows back in, versus finding out a week later when they're mixed with the neighbor's cow or the neighbor's cows are mixed with your cows, and your options there are to bring everything in and resort or just let it ride the way it is until the end of the grazing season and sort them on the back end. So there's a lot of interesting things there. Another example I'll throw out, just because this one happened to me personally, is we were working with a producer on a project using GPS ear tags on bulls just to track bulls, who is doing the work, who's moving around, servicing cows on range, and who's not. And we were pretty excited about this, and we actually put 163 tags out on these bulls. and they were still being dry lotted at the time. And I thought, wow, this is, like I said, I'm kind of a tech nerd. So this is really cool. I'm going to put this on my phone. I'm going to be tracking these animals just for fun, seeing how the system works. And it was great until it was time for them to ship those bulls out to their pasture. And every day I could tell you exactly which bulls got shipped because I was getting notifications nonstop on my phone that these bulls were traveling at unusual rates of speed. And so,
I thought that might be where that was going.
yeah,
That's
yeah. I used to think that cattle theft was a thing of the
yeah.
past, and it turns out
Wow.
talking to some producers out there, it's something that is still real today,
Yeah.
especially when you think of cattle prices. And some of these systems will give you notifications like if a cow is going down a highway at 60 miles an hour and she's supposed to be out in the pasture, you're gonna know. So
Right.
yeah,
That's incredible. That kind of we both have kids for those listening. It kind of reminds me of those apps, of those parents tracking their kids and where they're at.
yeah, yeah.
Like putting air tags on a backpack. Before we get too deep into more topics too, I negated to kind of talk about your relationship with our extension agents. I opened the show by always introducing the 97 locally based extension agents that serve Montanans in a variety of purposes. You're one of 45 subject matter experts or specialists, as we often call you. Can you talk, for the folks listening, talk a little bit more about how you support agents, how problems or concerns in counties or on reservations even escalate, or I shouldn't say problems escalating, but
Yeah.
issues come to your doorstep, and as an expert, how do you help folks out?
Yeah, well, I mean, I always view our extension agents, our county agents, as the local experts, right? They're the ones that are on the ground. So when you go to those agents in your county and talk to them, they know what the environment's been like. They know if you're in a drought. They know um, if you guys had some really bad weather, things like that. But I think it's always hard to be a expert of all things, right?
Right.
And so where I really feel that I fit into this is, as you mentioned, I'm a specialist in cattle, and so when you get those questions coming to an agent where it's a little bit deeper than their general knowledge, or it takes a little more thought, or it's something that's not a simple everyday type answer. I feel I say I'm sitting here as a resource for those individuals to reach out to um, figure out the tricky questions. So, a lot of the questions the agents can handle themselves. They have the knowledge base that they need, but I feel I'm there as a resource when they have those questions that are a little more in depth than, why is my cow limping today, or
Right.
something like that. So, why are conception rates not where they have been in the past, or things like that, and looking into like deeper cattle management and how things fit together. I feel like that's where I fit. And that being said, I'm always open to if a producer runs into me and has a specific question, or if I'm giving a presentation somewhere, like I'm always happy to work with them directly as well. But that's just kind of I just feel like I'm a resource. I'm here and available for those individuals when they have a question that maybe is a little further depth of knowledge than maybe what their background is.
Yeah, no, Sam, I think you explained that relationship really well, and I think it's what makes extension so unique. And I think our very common catchphrase is, "If I don't know the answer, I'm going to find someone who does." And that's for those listening that maybe haven't connected with with their local county or reservation extension agent. I encourage you to go to montana.edu/extension and connect with your local office. Our directory is very easy to use, and just like Sam was saying, if you have those pretty simple questions, that agent probably can answer it for you. I tend to pitch our agents as generalists. They have kind of baseline, sometimes specialized knowledge in a lot of topics. But like you said, if it goes beyond that kind of, hey, my cow's limping today, more into, how do I completely redo my pasture, or how do I find new sources for local beef? That might be something that escalates to a specialist. So thank you for explaining that relationship. And I really do encourage those listening, please do connect with your agent. So getting a little more deep into some topics I have drafted up for us here, Sam. I was curious about dormant season grazing. and some of your research and work has also focused on protein supplementation strategies and shifting resources to lower cost forages in this current economic environment, which I feel like we could always say it's a current economic environment because
Sure.
agriculture is always expensive, inputs are always expensive, gas, diesel, corn, and making these adaptations without impacting performance of cattle negatively. What is your research around those topics, and maybe how does it intersect a bit with profitability and just saving farmers or ranchers money?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the first thing that we gotta think about is that usually, a beef cattle producer's number one cost is feed costs. So, when you think about input cost anyway, it's usually the feed of that animal to get them through whatever period you're trying to feed them through. And so the concept of dormant season grazing would be typically for your spring caver group is after weaning. A lot of our guys will wean somewhere around that late September, early October time period. How do we get those cows to go back out on range, utilize whatever forage is out there? And to be honest, that forage is not going to meet that animal's nutrient requirements most years. This might be the exception of years. Yeah, this
It's been a
fall.
weird weather.
Yeah, yeah, this fall was more like a spring than a fall, but on our general years, that forage is definitely not gonna meet those animals' nutrient requirements, and so how do we utilize some of these low quality dormant season forages, and reduce reliance on having to feed those animals? So, for instance, can we kick those animals back on range, let them graze, depending on your calving season, maybe even through December, maybe even into some of January before having to feed hay. And that's going to be regionally dependent, whether or not you have open ground to even go graze or if you're in a heavy snow load area. But if we can delay feeding hay, the longer we can delay feeding hay, the cheaper, I guess, that can be. And so we kind of coin it as let's keep those cows in their working clothes as long as possible, before we have to bring them in and feed them. And so what we end up doing a lot of research on is just how do we utilize that forage, in a way that those animals do not lose body condition. We need to make sure where they gain and maintain body condition before winter so that when they go into calving, they're where they need to be nutritionally to be set up for success. And typically that requires some kind of protein supplementation program. And so we've done a lot of research looking at different types of protein supplements, different forms, whether that's a loose meal, pelleted, or a block, and then how does the herd interact with that supplement in terms of meeting their target protein intakes. I always joke around with my students that protein's one of our most expensive macronutrients, and I always say if you don't believe me, next time you're in the grocery store, look at the price of a head of lettuce compared to a T-bone steak.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and I
That's a
think
good way to describe it,
yeah.
especially for undergraduates.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think it's something we really need to look at. And so the goal is we only want them to eat enough protein to meet those animals' requirements. And once they've done that, then they have all the tools they need to gain what they need from a relatively low quality forage base. And
Yeah.
so that essentially just reduces the reliance on how long you need to feed hay.
Interesting. No, I mean, yeah, input cost. I have family that ranch, and being here in Montana and working with our agents, and you see, from our partners at Northern Ag Network or at Morning Ag Clips, you see those market prices, and you see the cost of gas, and you start thinking about having to hay and how much bringing all that in is going to impact that production throughout the year, from a return on investment standpoint, from just a profitability standpoint. So I'm glad we talked about that a bit, and kind of moving on. Let's talk more about individual animals. You've done some research and work on, the age of cattle within herds and body conditioning. How does that influence these supplements as far as an intake and waste standpoint? We have a lot of, well, all of Montana's winter rangeland, right? And so what grouping or feeding strategies have you recommended in your research or in your presentations, that kind of going off that last topic there?
Yeah, well, I mean, the simple answer is it depends, right?
Yeah.
You know, there's no, like I said earlier with the technology and stuff, there's no silver bullet here. But what we have found is depending on what kind of supplement you're using, you can be pretty successful with different systems. So we've used a 25% salt limited protein pellet on a mixed age herd that ranged from cows over 10 years old to that year's first calf heifer group. And we found that all those animals were able to consume that supplement at target rates on an individual basis. And what makes that a really important metric, I guess, for the viewers or listeners to think about is that when you think about a protein supplement in intake, what you're doing is a lot of times we don't have the ability to measure individual animal intake. So what you do is, well, I got 100 head. They need 2 pounds of protein or 2 pounds of this supplement per head per day. And so I feed 200 pounds. And then it's all
Just a little bit of math.
yeah. And then it's all gone, right? But you don't know, did one cow eat 4 pounds and one cow didn't get any, or how did that all work? And so jumping back into that technology, we have some pretty cool systems here where we can put these supplements in a trailer that records every animal that comes up and how much supplement it eats. And through that research, we found, the traditional mantra, if you will, was that when you have a mixed age herd, it's your dominant cows, your mid-age cows, your 4, 5, 6 year old cows that are going to get all the supplement, and your yearlings and subdominant animals might not get any, and then some of your old cattle might not get any. And so by doing a bunch of this research, what we found is that may not be the case. If it's a supplement that's easily consumable, um, we found that our yearlings are hitting those target rates just as much as the old cows, just as much as the dominant cows. The trick becomes is when we start limiting, um, trying to limit that intake. We don't want to feed too much. So whatever we're doing to limit it, whether that's salt or putting it in a block and making it hard, when we physically limit intake through a block, I don't think our heifers have figured out how do I even eat a block, right?
Mhm.
And so your older cows are going in, they know the route, they go, they figure it out, they eat, so they're hitting target. But what we find is like some of our heifers who don't know what's going on, and shoot, they don't even have their mature teeth yet, so they can't even figure out how to use this block. They're definitely not coming in and eating that full amount. So in those instances, it might be best if you want to use a block to split those younger animals off into a separate herd so they have more time to figure out. Or if you want to keep them together, I would maybe recommend using more of like a pelleted type supplement where, a heifer knows how to eat a pellet or could figure that out really quickly, but licking on a block and getting enough protein off that block is a little tricky.
Right. Really interesting. No, and I appreciate you kind of deep diving more into that. I think we're going to have a lot of interested producers out there that are curious about that, some of those strategies that you just mentioned. And I do love how with some of these questions I've pitched at you today, it does depend because Montana is the fourth biggest state in the country by land area. We have variability in our climate. We have producers that have different quality and land needs, land access and such, water access, things like that. So when you get those calls, Sam, from maybe escalating from the agent or directly from that producer, it seems like your mindset really is like, if you haven't worked with that producer in the past, like I need to lay the land first because you're not all cut from the same cloth. There are differences in how that producer is going to want to operate and what they have to operate with, right?
Yeah, and I think supplementation is a good example of that. So if you're a producer, for instance, who wants to work on some winter grazing and supplement and nutrition, and your cows are 30, 40, 50 miles from home out on a pasture, the strategies that you're going to utilize to supplement those cows are going to be different if they're right out your backyard. And so we talk about things like hand feeding versus self feeding. And the self feed's going to be like your block or a protein supplement that has some kind of level of salt in it to limit how much those animals will eat versus like a cake or even an alfalfa hay, if you're going to use that as a supplement. Um, if they're out the back door, it's very little labor investment to just go hand feed those animals every day. And so what we found is that with hand feeding, you have less variation. The animals have competition with each other, so they all go and eat and they can't fight because if they fight, then the next cow is going to come in and eat their portion. So they're just going in and eating. And so you end up with less variation of your intake versus when you put a tub out there and they kind of come and go as they please, maybe they'll come in one day, eat twice what they're supposed to that day, but then they don't come in the next day. And so there's some things going on there. And so it really depends on the ranch. And so one of the things I always tell folks is like I've seen ranchers that are neighbors. They ranch on the opposite side of the road of each other. They're both very successful ranchers. They both have been doing it. The family's been doing it for 100 years and do very well. But when you look at their management strategies, they're could be polar opposites, but
Right.
they're both successful. And it's all on what is your ranch? What is your ranching objectives? Like, what is your management strategy? What are you trying to do versus um, maybe another rancher? Like, if your management strategies are different or your objectives are different, then how we approach doing things is going to be different. So you're absolutely right. So first thing I do um, when I get a question is, well, we need to talk about, okay, well, what's your goals? What's your objectives? What are the resources you have available? How are you managing these animals? And what are you looking to gain from whatever the discussion is we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that was really well said, and I think that's, again, we talked about 45 specialists or subject matter experts working for extension. That's really the expectation that we have for these specialists is let's not pigeonhole or force producers or farmers or whoever comes to work with us to do things exactly this way, right? It's like you've got some producers that raise organic, you've got some producers that are conventional, some producers, like you said, that have this strategy, and another that's going to use a different one. And I really like how we adapt and provide support either way. And I think you said that really, really well. I'm gonna save my favorite question for last and skip ahead here and talk about the concept or not the concept, but talk about wildfire. We are constantly in the state of Montana as far as agricultural production goes, constantly facing the threats that are associated with drought, threats that are associated with fire. So can you talk and maybe expand on some of your research and the work and the presentations you've done on grazing management metrics and things such as diet quality, supplements. We've talked a little bit about supplements already today, and how producers track and evaluate performance and the profitability of their operations. Again, we don't have to get too deep into the economic weeds or anything like that, but all of this in terms of dealing or recovering from fire and drought.
Yeah, I was just actually having a conversation with a colleague about some of these type things recently, and they're things that we think we know a lot about, and you look at management strategies that have been around for a while, and logically they make a lot of sense. But as you dig, there may not be as much science behind that logic as we thought, and so some of the projects we've been doing is related to wildfire is or before I jump into that, the other thing is that maybe a study was done somewhere in one location. We'll say like the Great Basin, for example, a place that gets very little moisture. All of it almost comes as winter precip. And they do a study there and they find some finding. Sometimes that result will get adopted across regions where some of these things we're talking about are very regionally dependent. Some species of forage co-evolved with fire and grazing intensity. Some species didn't. So understanding where you are regionally and how different management strategies fit for whatever we're talking about are important. And so one of those things that have come up with some of my rangeland ecology colleagues is what is the science behind grazing after wildfire, and how does that apply to Montana? And so I don't know if I would say this was lucky, but a few years ago, there was actually a wildfire that came down across part of our Red Bluff Research Ranch as part of Montana State University outside of Norris, Montana. And we saw an opportunity to pair with, collaborate with some rangeland ecology guys. And we put together some different pins across that burn and then looked at different grazing strategies and timing after burn of grazing. I think that's really important because when you're looking at grazing on federal grounds, a lot of the general management is a 2-year deferment of, or at least a full year's rest and maybe a spring deferment of being able to graze on that burned ground. And the thought is that gives those plants time to recover, grow back to the robustness that they were before, maybe become reproductively active again, setting seed, flowering, things like that. Um, But do we know if that is a true effect? And logically, it makes sense. And so Montana's a little different than the Great Basin. We do get some continental spring storms, summer storms that come in and have some precipitation associated with it. So we did some work there. There's still more work to do, but give any specific recommendations of whether it's okay to go, and like we've talked about, it's just all context dependent. Like
Right.
some places might not be as bad to graze sooner after fire than other places. It kind of has to do with what was the condition prior to the fire, how big of a fire, how hot of a fire, things like that. One of the things to tie this back into your first question on precision agriculture that I think there's some really good potential for is that when you have an allotment that say was burned, maybe say only 25% of that allotment was burned, but it's managed as an allotment. And so there's a good chance that you're going to have to let arrest that entire allotment, even though 75% of it or half of it or whatever could still be. That's a huge forage cost for a producer. That's monumental because now they got to source that forage from somewhere else. They're either going to have to buy hay or they're going to have to lease more ground or they're going to have to do something to incur that cost. And so one of the things that I think has some serious potential is the use of virtual fence. We can go out there and map where that fire was. And then with the use of a virtual fence system, potentially graze the 75 or the 50% that did not burn and not have quite as big of a hit on our forage needs than we would have otherwise.
Will you say those recommendations and those strategies that you've worked through with producers in that last scenario that you just talked about, just being blunt here, has that saved them money?
Virtual fence?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it depends. It depends. So I tell people I'd give a lot of talks on virtual fence, and I have developed some list of questions that producers should ask themselves because I think we can get lost in the coolness factor of what I call it of, hey, this is really cool. And that can maybe blind whether it's economical
Right.
sometimes. And I think about myself in that sense. Like, I think drones are cool. I have a drone. Is it economical for me to have that drone? No, I just fly it around. Unless you count the enjoyment that I get from flying it
It's
around.
like having a really nice new truck. Do you really need the really nice new one or just one that gets you by?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. But what I have found, I gave you the examples of producers finding out their cows were out, and I don't know what the value of that is, but there's some value there. The producer who was able to save some of his cows that he heard about or saw, got the app warned him about that he was able to save. You look at the cost of heifers right now, and that's a huge cost
Right.
savings. And then I've heard producers talk about that benefit of freeing up available forage that was previously not grazed or not available. And so I think about those potentials. It's it can be substantial. One of the questions that I pose to producers that I think that really will say, will this help you or is it not? Is are you looking for just I don't care if these cows where they are in this pasture. I just want to make sure they stay in this pasture. Is that your goal? You just want 100% containment? Or are you looking for flexible management to do things that you haven't been able to do before, to keep cattle out of certain areas, to make them go to other areas? Is that your goal? Because those are two different questions. To me, the cost of virtual fence, if you're just looking for 100% containment, um, you might as well just build a fence.
Yeah.
And fence ain't cheap either. So I mean, just kind of pick your poison there. But if you're looking for the flexibility of management and then maybe having something, just having an eye on those animals over time, that's when virtual fence I think is gonna play a role.
Yeah. I think we could have done a whole podcast today on virtual fence.
Yeah.
We'll have to do a follow-up on that,
Yeah.
and that is where I, having recalled seeing you at, presentations, that's certainly an area of expertise for you. But to kinda move on to our last thing I'd like to talk with you about today, Sam, is, in your role, and we're very fortunate at, MSU Extension, we have 2 beef cattle specialists, Megan Van Emmen, who's based at Fort Keogh, I believe,
Yep.
in the south, east part of the state, manages or addresses a variety of topics similar to Sam, but also different. So that means we've got 2 folks that maybe can answer unique questions related to beef. And of course, beef in Montana is a huge industry. But since you've been here with us in Extension, you've helped manage the Montana Nutrition Conference, and huge news for everyone listening, 75th anniversary this year. So you're going to see some news and information go out about that. The conference, I'm going to let Sam talk about it here in a minute, is April 15th through the 16th. Is registration open quite yet, or
Not
it's
quite.
coming soon?
We're trying to almost.
Awesome.
We just wrapped up our agenda, and so we wanted to make sure people could see what the agenda was before committing to registration.
Right.
But yeah, I think momentarily within the next couple of weeks, we'll probably start seeing registration opening up.
Perfect. And just recalling that we're not live, we're recording a podcast here. I will say by the time that this is published, registration will be open. So we're recording end of January here. For those listening, you're probably listening when it first came out, late February or early March. But anyways, I'm going to stop blabbering. Sam,
Yeah.
tell me about the nutrition conference. I'm hoping I can make it this year.
Yeah. Well, we're really excited about it. Like you said, it's our 75th year, so it's been a long going conference that we're really proud of. And so today, or this year's um, theme is Tradition Meets Innovation: 75 Years of Stewardship, Science, and Shaping Tomorrow. The conference is really built around, in my opinion, is trying to get industry, producers, academia, extension agents, all in a room together to discuss and listen to speakers who are professionals in the specific subject matters, talk about things that are relevant to Montana. And so I just to give you guys a little bit of a sneak peek on some of the speakers we have 4 different speakers that are going to be discussing different aspects of the beef cattle industry related to cow size. That's been a question that we get a lot and has been going on for decades. You know, if you track cow size over time, there was times where we called them belt buckle cattle. They were only about as tall as your belt buckle, and then there's been cattle out there, or times when cattle were exceeding or pushing 6 foot tall. So, what is the appropriate size? What does it matter? Things like that. So we're gonna have somebody speak from the cow calf perspective. We're gonna have somebody speak on heterosis, and terminal crosses and how to breed for certain things. We have some folks coming in from Texas. They're going to talk about cow size from a feedlot perspective. And then finally, we have somebody coming in from AgriBeef that's going to talk from a packer's perspective. Following that, we always try to put somebody in there who's looking at markets. So we actually have Montana State's own Eric Belasco coming in to talk about current state of beef cattle markets and where trends are headed to. Coccidiosis is always a big topic in the cattle world, especially after weaning and some of the winter weather and coming into spring. And so we have an expert coming in from Elanco that's going to be talking about management, prevention strategies for coccidiosis. Because we are looking into the future on this, we actually have some folks coming in that have been doing work with technology and monitoring, remote sense monitoring of pasture conditions and setting up real-time uh, supplementation programs on the fly with virtual fence, like all kinds of tech and how that could be utilized in fine-tuning management of cattle on grazing ground. So that's going to be kind of a neat futuristic kind of talk. And we got some others too coming that are going to be I think it's going to be a really good program this year. So, for those of you listening, this takes place April 15th and 16th. It's going to be here in Bozeman at the Grand Tree Hotel there, just off the freeway there on 7th. Yeah, we'd love to see you there. We are doing our best to try to grow this conference and get it as big and serving as many people as we possibly can.
Yeah, Sam, you've done a great job with this conference. It's one of those larger events that Extension is honored to host, and like you said, we're bringing in people internally, like Eric Belasco. He's a very very high quality speaker, and I'm sure he'll have some interesting market updates for folks. And so, yes, that's again the Montana Nutrition Conference hosted by Dr. Wyffels, our specialist here, April 15th to 16th in Bozeman. And again, perfect timing for our podcast. Once this is published, registration will be open. So either keep an eye on our websites, montana.edu/extension, or connect with your extension agent. They'll know where to get you signed up or how to send you the link. And we really hope to see everyone that's listening there.
Yeah, if I could
Oh,
add,
please do. Yeah.
if I can add real quick, we actually partner with the Montana Feed Association with the nutrition conference, and We look back, and I think that partnership has been for the full 75 years as
Oh,
well.
wow.
So yeah, just the partnership with Montana Feed Association and Extension putting this on really helps us bring in the industry folks and the producers across the state. And so, yeah, feel free to reach out to me personally if you have any questions on the nutrition conference. But if you happen to know anybody that's associated with the Montana Feed Association, they're also uh, really knowledgeable and help put this together as well.
Yeah, no, we always need to, that's one of the best parts about hosting extension events, whether they be local or statewide, is it's rare that we don't partner with somebody in industry or somebody, perhaps government agencies, USDA. Are there any other sponsors or people supporting the conference we should know about?
Yeah, we haven't sent out our sponsor list lately. Okay, we're still working on that, but yeah, we end up with a lot of sponsors. So a lot of industry sponsors. For instance, Zenpro and the Montana Feed Association typically sponsor an entire poster competition for our students. So whether that's graduate research or our graduate proposal, or we're even expanding that into a undergraduate experiential learning program as well. So, if nothing else, it's always great to see our students out presenting to industry folks and producers alike on what we're doing here at Montana State and the educations that we're providing throughout the different colleges and departments.
That's awesome. Yeah, we really do have some great conferences and events that blend that public outreach extension side with the student side. And from my perspective in my role with MSU, I always look at it as an opportunity to recruit too. Let's get
Yep.
those students to come work as extension agents maybe after they graduate. Get them connected with industry as well. Um, well, this flew by today, Sam. I really appreciate your time. Is there maybe a parting thought on the topic of ag profitability as it relates to the beef cattle industry that you might want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of things. So the two main things that we talked about in terms of supplementation and precision agriculture. So like I said, I always tell producers when it comes to the technology, it doesn't hurt to take a step back, review it, see if anybody else is doing that technology around you and how it's working for them. Get some ideas before jumping in there, and make sure you do your due diligence. There's a lot of companies out there that are offering different niches, different services, and um, the difference between success and failure sometimes is just making sure that you're matching up with the right company for your management goals. So keep all that stuff in mind if you are thinking about the technology. The last thing I want to say when it comes to supplementation, as I mentioned, protein supplement can be awfully expensive sometimes, and sometimes I think it's like the tech world. In some sense, it's really easy to be sold by a salesman on the latest and greatest supplement out there. Keep in mind when we're grazing those dormant forages, what we're really after is just getting some protein to those animals. And alfalfa hay sometimes can be just as good as a supplement as long as we can feed it at the rate that we're looking for. And so I always tell producers, if you are looking for some kind of a supplementation program, take what the cost is per ton of that feed, multiply that by the percent protein in that feed, and calculate how much does it cost for a pound of protein. If that's what you're really after is protein, how much are you paying per pound of protein? And a lot of times that will help you make your decision from a profitability standpoint. And I can say, just working with some producers this year, we've ran into alfalfa is actually relatively cheap compared to past years. And so if you are in a situation where you can hand feed those cows, go out there every other day or 3 times a week and feed those cows, that might actually pay out to be your best supplementation strategy.
Well, great way to close this out there, Sam. And I hope we get to do this again. Again, for those listening, this is the Profitability in Montana Agriculture podcast. Our guest today has been Sam Wyffels, MSU Extension Beef Specialist. Thanks again, Sam, for your time. I'm John Hawley, Director of Communications for MSU Extension. Thank you so much for listening.